So getting started, we're going to go back over the October 2024 20-year-old female diagnostic patient. So what we did last week, we staged. So what we're going to go do this week is we're going to go back and score. I'm going to click on continue scoring record. That's just the patient information, same patient from last time. So we stopped at 93. You can see all the staging that we did. That last epoch is going to be stage room. I'm going to work with the respiratory montage here instead. So in ISR, when you're first given your montage, everything is kind of zoomed in already. So I'm going to go through and just kind of adjust everything. So let me get back to the epoch to start. Okay, so now I'm just evening out my channels here. So on the left, when you hover over your channel, you can see a minus and a plus button there. I'm just gonna decrease mine so they're not all intercepting each other. So that definitely looks a lot better. So I am noticing a little bit of artifact in that bottom channel there. That's pretty much okay as long as you have your main wave that goes along with it. So just looking, we're going to be looking at a total of 4 at a time. So when you're going through your scoring, usually you can do anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. I personally like to do 5 minutes. What ISR provides you with is a 2-minute window. So we have a total of 4 epochs, 30 seconds each epoch, for a total of 2 minutes across our screen. Now, a quick way to get to the 2-minute screen versus when you're looking at a regular epoch of 30 seconds, you can just click your spacebar and it'll actually transform it for you. So between your staging and your scoring screen. So what we're going to be looking for is any changes in the flow of these lines. So you have your top 2 airflow lines and your bottom 2 respiratory effort. So in our first and second, we're at 0 in epoch 1. We see a continuous flow. You do have that artifact that, as long as it has that main flow to it, it's okay. Moving on to epoch 2, there is a little difference here. We are seeing some flat lines. So if you look here in the snore channel, you can actually also see that the patient was snoring continuously just up until that moment. So despite that little artifact in the abdomen belt, you can see that even when the patient has that central, so the movement stopped, it still continued to work, or not work in the sense of movement. So since all the lines are flat, that bottom abdomen belt is still pretty reliable in a sense of scoring. So you see exactly where the snoring stopped. It's likely because of a possible arousal. But since the stage of this epoch 2 was already as 3, so I can immediately assume that there was an arousal and the patient immediately fell back asleep. Oftentimes on onset you will get those central apneas. So another thing that we want to look at when looking at these 4 epochs here is also looking at the changes in oxygen levels. So it looks like our starting is around 95, kind of hovering around 95, 94. Now after that supposed arousal at that 30-second mark, our second marks are up there at the top, so you can see from 5 to 40 all the way up until 95, 115. That's each total between those 4 epochs. So back to the oxygen level, our main change happens around it's kind of covered up by the little options bar at the top, but underneath the options is where our 60-second is. So we see that it peaks up at 96. If you look just behind the central apnea that happened between 40 and 50, you will see it immediately drops after. So starting at between 50 and looks like 60, there's a 6% desat. Just remember, all our saturations are based out of 100 to qualify for that hypopnea for AASM and for ISR purposes. We're going to remember that we are using the 3% rule. So you see all these flat lines here. So these flat lines, or this central apnea, is what led up to that drop in oxygen level. You see right after that patient does do 2 little strong breaths after it, and then after that you can see the oxygen levels going back up immediately after. So if we're looking between 55 and 70, you see it gets down to 90, but there's a 5% increase. So after that central that we had there, that contributed to the 6% decrease, and then you have those strong breaths that happen immediately after, contributing to its immediate increase after the patient kind of regulates their breathing after that pause. So I'm going to add in that we had that central apnea, right clicking and going under respiratory, and I'm going to highlight it here by highlighting one of the channels, going over it, and then you can just type your different events. For our central apnea, so with the tag on each of these notations, you can actually see the duration. So you want to be sure that that's 10 seconds or more for you to score anything. So the one thing that all respiratory events have in common is going to be that 10 seconds minimum. We're going to move on to epoch number 3. So we see a few changes in the oxygen again. The lower peak is 90 up to 96, but then it does kind of go back down. So earlier I said that the baseline was around 94, 95. So 96 was a little bit over their normal. So I'm not too surprised that caused that. But you can see in these this area here between 25, around 30 to 40. You see those two breaths. Honestly, I highlighted just those two breaths, but honestly, the two breaths before them could be included as well. Perspective wise, especially looking at their previous breaths, but there was that 3% desaturation coming from 96 down to 93. So you can see in the change in the airflow height. So you can see the difference between both of those airflow channels where it decreased, and we're going from the bottom of the start of that first breath to the start of the last breath where it originally changes. So you can see the difference in the amplitude of both of them. So, and by both of them, referring to the breath at between 25 and 30 and the breath between 40 and 45. So you can see there, we have that decreased airflow. So it's not exactly something that you'll be scoring necessarily. I'm just kind of making a notation of it. So the notation is just kind of annotation. Specifically for your viewing purposes, I'm going to go in, right click in my respiratory and add in that hypopnea that we just saw. So through epoch 3, we picked up that hypopnea that just kind of made our duration minimum. I think it was about 10.07 seconds. So we scored that as a hypopnea. So you want to remember with your hypopneas, typically with your desaturations, they're going to happen after that decreased airflow. So I wanted to put in that decreased airflow note as well as the hypopnea note so you can see exactly what the hypopnea is. So hypopneas cause the desaturation, but the hypopnea is the low air. So hypo meaning low, pnea meaning air. So again, hypopnea is the decreased flow of the air, not the desaturation. But in order to score hypopnea, according to the AASM guidelines, you are going to have that 3% desaturation caused by that low flow of air. Okay, so moving on, we're going to be looking at our next set. So we finished off on 3, so now looking here at 4. The first thing we want to look at is our oxygen levels here. You see it's pretty consistent from the beginning of the epoch to the end at about 95. We're going to be looking for any changes in our flow channels, specifically any drops in amplitude, drops in height, and any flat lines. So nothing there, so we're going to continue on to the next. So we can pretty much see that at least in these 4 epochs from 4 to 7 is continuous airflow, not really any changes, so no drops in amplitude and no flat lines. So again, you see here in the bottom belt we do have that artifact, but as long as you have those main points you see that are following the flow of the chest belt, it shouldn't really cause too many problems. We're going to continue on. So now we're looking at epoch 7 through 10 here. So again, we're going to be looking at the continuous airflow and continuous effort, as well as our continuous oxygen level. So you see there's no really changes in airflow or effort. So typically with that, there's not going to be many changes in the oxygen levels. You see she is kind of floating around 94, 95% SaO2, which is good. So looking in these next 4 epochs, there doesn't seem to be much changes. So nothing specifically to score here. So continuing on, we're going to be looking a little bit into our snore channel. So you can see compared to beforehand, not really much snoring going on. So we're going to go ahead and continue on. So we're going to look at our next set of 4 epochs here. We're going to look at epoch 11 through 14. So first we'll look in our flow and our effort channels to see that there's not any flat lines. Do see some types of changes. We'll get into that. Our oxygen levels seem to remain around 94, 95 as before, which is pretty expected as there were no changes in the airflow channels, as well as no changes going into REM sleep, which is typically where you'll see some very specific changes in the oxygen levels, especially if they're consistent throughout the night. You'll start to see some changes. So our patient's still in stage 2. We do see some slight changes around epoch 12, where it goes down to about 93%. Then goes back up to 95. But specifically what we're going to be looking for is that 3%. So if you highlight each channel in ISR, you can actually see what your baseline is pretty much looking like in each channel with that line there. So you can see if there's any significant or even just slight changes that you may not be able to see with just your eyes. So again here, doing the same thing in the pressure channel, lining up that line to see where the baseline is about at, to see if there's any changes. So they're at between 50 and 55. You do see that increase in the pressure channel, so a slight increase in the air, which could be compensating for any slight drops in oxygen. So going on to the next, we're at 14 through 17. So you can see here in that pressure channel, let's go ahead and put that baseline line there. You can see that there's a change happening around between 25 and 35 there. So compared to the previous breaths that you can see at 20 and at 35. So you can even slightly see it in the thermistor channel there. But when we're looking specifically to score any hypopneas, we're going to look specifically in this pressure channel. So according to your AASM, hypopnea is scored in your pressure channel when there's a reduction, a 30% amplitude reduction in the airflow, depending on the pressure. So with hypopneas, we know that the pressure channel is showing us an amount of air that a patient is breathing in and breathing out. So you can see that the amount of air has changed. If you look at the bottom of the last breath and the bottom of the second breath there, you can see a very big difference, showing that there was a slight shallow breath that happened in that little bit of time. So you can also see that the changes in oxygen levels happen just about around the same time. So we started at 95, it goes down to about 93. Remember, that's still 2%, so we're not really concerned about it, but we're just notating. And then after that, it goes up to 95. You see with that big breath that happens at 35, right after the decreased airflow in the pressure channel. So the breath between 35 and 40, it's a pretty big breath. It takes us from our 93 back up to 95, which is about their baseline. So even though there was that desaturation and that slight decreased airflow, since we do not have that 3% desaturation there, it only went down 2% from 95 to 93. We're not going to score any hypopneas or anything. So we do have the decreased airflow there. But remember, when you're scoring, a decreased airflow has to be accompanied by your 3% desaturation before you're scoring, specifically scoring a hypopnea. Now, you can just kind of notate that there is some decreased airflow that goes on. You can also see in that top of the snore channel, you can start to see the patient start to do a little bit more snoring, which can also help compensate with any lack of airflow. So sometimes instead of hypopneas and whatnot, the patient can start to snore, which is basically a sign that the air is getting past their airways, a little rattling along their airways. So looking back at that pressure channel, not only was there that change at between 20 and 35, we're also seeing a change between 110 and 115. So you can see the top of that breath of the ones before at 100 and 105 are a lot stronger. And even specifically looking at the bottom of the breath at 115, you can see the major difference. So I'm going to move forward. That way we can see the full epoch to see if there's any changes in between epoch 17 and 18. So here I'm just basically scoring one, first determining if the duration is enough, which it was 10.48 seconds, you can see. And I want to put in a note that this is the decreased airflow. We haven't exactly looked into the oxygen levels, so I'm not going to necessarily say it's a hypopnea yet, but once we take a look at the oxygen levels and any changes, we can determine that. So you see our oxygen levels are still kind of floating around 94, 95. Despite that little decreased airflow that we had there, in those 10 seconds, the oxygen seems to stick around. Still at that 95, 94 floating area there. So not any 3% desaturations that we can see. If it were to be a 3% desaturation, we'd be looking for a 92. Because at the end of that event, the end of the decreased airflow is typically going to be around the start of the desaturation in oxygen. So here again, we also see that slight decrease in airflow, similar to the one between 20 and 30, at around 35 to 50-ish. Even the one at right before 50 is still a little low, but compared to the ones at 40 and 45, you can see, looking at the bottom of that channel, that is a pretty significant difference. So you see that one came out to be 11.8 seconds. I'm going to add another decreased airflow here. And this is going to be a possible hypopnea. Let me fix that. Possible hypopnea because we haven't really determined, okay, I can't type. We haven't really determined if there was a desaturation that happened yet. So I'm going to click save and then go back to the oxygen channel, your SaO2, see if there's any 3% drops. So we peaked at 95. What we'd be looking for is at 92% oxygen. Remember, that is that 3%. And do remember that 3% is just your minimum. So with your hypopneas, you can get desats of 5, 10, even up to 15, 20, 25%, depending on how long that decreased airflow lasted. And the integrity of the patient's lungs, airway, and stuff like that. So despite that decreased airflow, it looks moving into epoch 19, there isn't any changes in that SaO2. So that possible hypopnea is a definite not hypopnea. So after that, we see that the airflow kind of continues on. There's a slight drop here and there, but nothing that seems long enough for 10 seconds. Remember, all events, one thing they have in common is that minimum of 10-second duration. Again, talking about minimum because, apnea can last as long as 20, 30, 40, 50, even 60 seconds, a minute long. I've seen some even longer than that. So moving on, looking at these next 4 epochs, they seem to be pretty consistent. That abdomen belt artifact that we were seeing before is kind of fixing up itself, sort of, kind of, not really. But remember, what we're going to be looking at is for flat lines. Flat lines or increased amplitude when it comes to the effort channels. That will signify your respiratory effort-related arousals. Only one thing in ISR, we actually don't score any of the rears of respiratory effort-related arousals because we are basing all of this on the AHI. AHI being the apnea-hypopnea index. So how many apneas or hypopneas are you having per hour? When it comes to rears, that's calculated in what's called the RDI, your respiratory disturbance index, same where snoring will be at. So looking here in the thermistor channel, not really many changes. Using our baseline reference line. Same in the pressure channel here, is pretty consistent. You do have a slight bigger breath around, about between 80 and 85, but nothing that really caused any significant changes. As you can see down here in the oxygen levels, seems to be floating around 95 again. So moving on, we're going to look at 22 through 25. So again, typically what I like to do in my scoring screen, I don't necessarily go epoch per epoch, although ISR does give you this red box kind of highlight on each individual epoch you're on. Typically when I'm scoring, this is a 2-minute window. Again, I like to use 5 minutes, but regardless of what minute I'm using, I like to look at it as a whole screen rather than epoch by epoch. So here I'm looking at all 4 epochs. I'm looking at this as an entire screen to see if there's any changes in that thermistor channel, any changes in the pressure channel, or any changes that will likely accompany the possible apnea or hypopneas we have, such as flat lines if there's a central apnea in the effort channels, or flat lines that will be in the flow channels if there was a obstructive apnea rather than a central. So looking at the top and bottom of this pressure channel, you see some slight changes, not really anything significant, but you do want to take a look down at the oxygen levels to see if there's any changes beyond 3%. So continuing to look, not really much happening. There is a 2% desaturation, but we're going to continue on. So we're now looking at 26 through 29. So again, looking at this as a whole screen, there isn't really much happening. Well, there's definitely much happening. The patient's breathing continuously, which is good. Kind of what we're looking for. Well, not necessarily, but kind of what we're hoping for. So, we're always hoping for the patient to continuously breathe, but in the scoring sense, we are looking for any stoppages or alterations in breathing. So there wasn't really much going on with the oxygen levels and no changes in amplitude, airflow, or effort channels. We're going to continue on. So here again, we're going to look at our oxygen levels, kind of floating around 95, 94. So if there were to be any desaturations beyond 3%, remember we will be looking at 92% oxygen since our baseline is about 95. And you see it does drop down to about 93. Again, that's your 2% desaturation. Not exactly what we're looking for. Okay, after doing those, we're gonna go ahead and continue on. We're ending at, let's see, epoch 33. So I'm gonna move on to the next set of epochs here. We're gonna put 33 at the front, just so we can see if there's any changes between 33 and 34. So you can see some changes in our oxygen levels here, kind of fluctuating a bit between 93 and 95. But again, what we're looking for is that 3%. So with your SaO2, you do have this graphical mode and numerical mode. So it's also, while it's showing your numbers, it's also going to show kind of like a reference line. So you have your reference line in the center there to show if there's any significant drops or changes. So you can see when it slightly drops, slightly gains, so from 95 down to 93, and even back up to 95 there. So in other programs, you can actually choose whether you want your display to be in a numerical or a graphical kind of observation. Typically, I like to just use the numerical because we do have automatic 4% that we use. 4% desaturations are automatically scored at the VA. And I say 4% compared to ASM 3% because we do use Medicare guidelines where we're looking for a 4% desaturation rather than a 3% desaturation. So looking here at the flow, the pressure flow channel, we do see some changes. You see some stronger breaths, some slight decreased airflow breaths. And that's from looking at the top of the channel, but as well as looking at the bottom of the channel. But since we did already determine there's not any significant changes in our oxygen levels, we're going to continue on. So we're going to start here at 35, between 35 and 38. Now, first thing I'm seeing is I can initially see that change in that pressure channel. So between 5 and between 15, so it's about 10.17 seconds is our decreased airflow. And remember with that, I like to highlight that decreased airflow and then look down at the oxygen levels to see if there's any changes. So using the reference line, you can see that there's a big change when it comes to the decreased airflow within those seconds. And then you want to continue and look further ahead to see if you see any that are similar. So we can see in our thermistor channel, we have a continuous flow there using our reference line. Moving on to our pressure channel. A continuous flow, but a slight decrease in amplitude at times. Specifically at those first few seconds. So you can see the difference between those and the baseline. So this is the amplitude is much smaller than all the rest compared to it within these 4 epochs. And there's that slight change, 95 there. It doesn't really compare to the one between 5 and 15, but that's just something I'm going to keep note of. So looking back down at the oxygen levels here, again, not any 3% desaturation. Remember, our baseline is 95, hovering around 95, 94. So we're either looking for a 92% or a 91%. So 92 would be a 3% desaturation from 95, and 91 would be a 3% desaturation from 94. We're going to move on to our next set of 4 here. So we see some continuous effort lines, continuous airflow lines. We're going to go back with our reference line to see if there's any significant changes that we can see. Not really much going on, so we're going to go into our pressure channel. Using our reference line, we do see some breaths that are stronger than others, so it may be compensating for any of the shallow breaths that happen before them. So between 10 and 20, you have those strong breaths that happen after, and between 25 and about 40. A few times we're seeing here. But if we look back down to our oxygen levels despite any of this slightly decreased amplitude in our pressure channel. I believe that the increased airflow that happens just after it makes up for it. So between 10 and 20 there, see that decreased airflow compared to the breaths that happen after it. But thanks to those breaths that happen after it, that airflow only dropped down, that oxygen level only dropped between 95 to 93. So that 2% desaturation, those strong breaths bring it back up to about 94, 95, and even gets up to 96 around the 40-second mark. So you can see that another round of decreased airflow happens after those 2 strong breaths. So typically what that just means is that there is a compensation for the small breaths or shallow breaths, and typically a desaturation may not happen after it. So we have that decreased airflow in that first few seconds there. We already determined that after that decreased airflow, there wasn't any significant oxygen desaturation. So at that point, we'll move on. So honestly, you can actually look ahead when it comes to determining if you have any hypopneas by checking out the oxygen channel first. So look for our peak, our top and bottom peak. So bottom peak seems to be 93. Top peak seems to be 96, but you want to look at where those peaks fall. So the lower peak falls from 95. The upper peak gains from 93 to 96. But we want to be sure that it's not coming specifically. Hold on. There we go. It's not specifically happening from that decreased airflow. So here we have about 13 seconds of that decreased airflow to possibly have a hypopnea. Okay, so no hypopnea. There was no descent over 3%. I'm gonna hit save there. So it goes up to 96, but only goes back down to 94. So again, that 2% desaturation, it seems to be this patient's typical range. It typically goes down about 2% and then kind of comes back up. So looking back in the pressure channel to see if there's any other decreased airflow moments, specifically comparing it to that between 10 and 20, as well as between 30 and 40, where we had those slight drops in oxygen, but just not enough. I'm going to see if there's any moments similar to that, to where it may have produced a desaturation. So here we do have the little decreased airflow. We're going to close out of that. We're going to look back down at our oxygen channels. So you see it goes up to 96. So the peak right after the decreased airflow is 96. It does go down, but again, only to that 2%. Again, you can also just kind of determine that by looking at your airflow channel first for your set of epochs, whether it's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, however many you have on your screen. So we're going to continue on. We're going to start by looking at our flow channels. No real changes going on there. We can go to our pressure channel. We'll use our reference sign to see if there's any significant changes. When it comes to amplitude, there is. I can see a slight drop between 55 and 65. So looking at the bottom of these channels, of this channel, looking at the bottom peak of the amplitude, you can see that it doesn't really line up with the rest of them. So between 55 and 65 there. So we're going to have our decreased airflow. Possible hypopnea, let's see. It depends on our oxygen levels, but since I looked at our airflow first, we can go back and see. Remember, I put a question mark there because I haven't looked at my airflow yet, at my oxygen levels yet. Now, if you looked at your oxygen levels and you know for a fact that there's that 3% desaturation, that's when, instead of just observing that it's decreased airflow, it can actually be scored as a hypopnea. So you can see the difference between the bottom of the last breath of the decreased airflow and the breath that follows it. Typically, that's a pretty good indication that they have that decreased airflow going on. Sometimes your bottom peaks are more significant than your top peaks, but we look at them both to really determine. So looking at them both makes it easier, because sometimes the top of the peak may be similar to the breaths around it, kind of like that decreased airflow we just highlighted, but with the bottom peak being significantly shorter in amplitude. So we're going to go on. So we're going to look at this oxygen level here. See, we're floating around 95, 94. It does drop to 93 at a point, but we see that's coming down from 95, 94. So that's not going to be a 3% desaturation. So with looking at that, we can already say within these 4 epochs, there isn't any hypopneas per se, but we do want to look if there are any just slight changes in airflow amplitude. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue on. So we're at about 43 through 46 right now. So 43 through 46, I guess we could start down at the bottom here with the oxygen levels once again. So we see that it's around the baseline still, around 94 and 95% SaO2, which is good. Now we do have those 4 channels, these 4 epochs that we're looking at. We already determined that that slight decreased airflow from the beginning of 43 didn't have any change. So it was not qualified as a hypopnea in the sense of change from the oxygen levels. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at 44 through 47 here. So again, and what we like to look at is the full of the 4 epochs. So you can see at the end there is something going on there, likely a type of arousal or possibly any type of coughing that may go on. So as you can see, the increase in abdominal effort as well as the increased amplitude in the snore channel. Typically, that's an indication of a cough type idea. Usually when you're coughing, you're going to brace your abdomen a little harder, especially straight out of sleep. So it's likely that there's an arousal that accompanies that. We're going to look down here at the oxygen levels to see if that could possibly have been any change that caused that. So we see it peaks down at about 93 here. The top peaks being 95. It's actually 96 all the way at the end. But for these first 4 epochs of 44 through 47, no significant changes. So we're going to look through our airflow channels to see if there's any significant changes in amplitude. Despite there being any changes with our oxygen levels, we want to still look out for any decreases in airflow just to get familiar with the concept. So none in the thermistor channel or the pressure channel. So we're going to go on. We'll put 47 at the start. So we're now looking at epoch 47 through epoch 50. Close that. So what we're going to do is just kind of go back to see if there was an associated arousal. So as you can see, I'm now looking at my full screen, my full montage with everything included. So you can see in that big blue box up there, that is our big old arousal that happens at the end of epoch 47. That arousal causes not the patient to completely wake up, but they cause the patient to go back down into N1 sleep. So we can see if there's any possible hypopneas that can cause that. So they're not doing any hard continuous snoring. So, sometimes people snore and they might snore a little louder. Oftentimes getting some type of saliva in their throat, waking them up coughing. So from that, you can't really tell. So we're going to add in that there was the EEG arousal. That way we don't have to switch our montage at the same time. So we can continue to look at our respiratory channels. And that's just to add in to that we know that there was a previous arousal that happened. So you can see right after the arousal, the oxygen levels went down. So it peaked up at 96 and then went down to about 92. So in that moment, you can see in the snore channel again, that change in amplitude. Now, one thing that you can also see is that in the abdomen channel, there's not really much movement with decreasing the gain that can do. So you see how the abdomen channel is leaking into that chest channel. That's typically just very hard breathing, or in this sense, likely a cough that goes on. So if you were in the lab just making notations, I would make a notation that my patient is coughing, as well as the patient's coughing, just any other observations about what's going on at the time. So our oxygen levels, they're about 95. They drop down to 92 after. I'm going to put an average of about 95. You can also put in the sleep stage. The patient woke up coughing from stage N2 and went to stage N1. So those are just some of the things you can put in your annotations or your tech notes, documentation, just so when the doctor that's reviewing the study knows what's going on. So they know this patient isn't randomly breathing hard for these few seconds here. They're likely going through something. We're going to look back here at our pressure channel. And what we're going to do is be looking at our top and bottom of our pressure. So you can definitely see around the time of the cough, the top of the pressure channel has increased significantly in amplitude compared to those around it. So you see at this moment here, there's another decreased airflow. Now, whether it's a hypopnea is something that we can look at a little second later, once we focus in on the SaO2 channel. But there is a slight decrease in the airflow between 80 and about halfway or quarter to 100. So again, we're going to add in that decreased airflow. So we haven't exactly looked at the oxygen levels yet to see if that decreased airflow has caused anything. So another example was that zoom in that those few seconds towards the end in epoch 50. So we have another little form of decreased airflow. This one was about 11 seconds. So it seems after that patient had that possible coughing fit or just that arousal, as the word there didn't necessarily say that's what it is. Since they had that arousal, they had a few moments of decreased airflow after. So what we're going to be doing is looking at the oxygen levels that happened following the moments of decreased airflow to see if those qualify for being a hypopnea according to AASM guidelines. And if you ever forget, AASM is the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, which most sleep labs are going to follow when it comes to guidelines of staging, scoring, and setups. Okay, so in that first epoch number 50, we do have those moments of decreased airflow that we're going to notate in there. So before that 10-second mark, as well as between the 20 and 35-second mark. So you can see that duration was about 15 seconds. Remember, with your respiratory events, they're going to be a minimum of 10 seconds. So again, anything over 10 seconds is valid. Anything less than 10 seconds is not considered an event. So continuing on in that pressure channel, you do see another, what looks like an arousal. But we're going to look, let me go back. Okay, there we go. So we're going to look back in our SaO2 channel. So we already identified that we had some decreased airflow in epoch 50 as well as going into epoch 51. But as you can see in those airflow channels, we do have some 3% desaturations going on there. So in between about 30 and 55. 96% to 93% is going to be our 3% desaturation there. As well as one in that beginning. So we're going to add in that we have that hypopnea. So we're going to make sure to annotate the hypopnea in each epoch. So the decreased airflow caused the is the hypopnea and caused the desaturation there. Now there is the additional one in 50. So if you see that 96 down to 93 from the beginning of epoch 50 to the 20-second mark. So moving on, we do see that arousal kind of going on there. So that increase in abdominal effort, all of that there is all of the arousal. So typically with the arousals, you will have some type of change in your effort and airflow channels, especially if the patient's waking up, which this specific patient did. So you see in 52, the arousal happens at the end. There's a slight stoppage in airflow in the pressure channel. as well as a little bit in the thermistor channel. It's likely that the patient was probably just changing positions, especially with that much movement, and probably why the patient didn't go right back to sleep after, and they had a little bit of wake. So again, this is where we'll look at our amplitude when it comes to our pressure channel. So here between 20 and 30, we have another minimum of 10 seconds with that decreased airflow. So it looks like so it doesn't necessarily go all the way down to 93%, so it's only a 2% desaturation from 96 down to 94. So we'll notate that it's decreased airflow, but we know it's not hypopnea that accompanies it. We're going to move on to the next 4. So we're now at epoch 54 through 57. So we can see a little bit after that patient had that arousal that they're breathing a little bit harder. So if you can compare the first half, so up to about the 70 seconds, so where that patient first wakes up from that arousal, the airflow was kind of consistent, or for the most part, it's pretty consistent. And then once you get to where that patient was awake, you see they're breathing a lot stronger. And even when they make it into N1, it starts to decrease slightly. And you can look at the second 105 is where it kind of drops back down. So oftentimes people will, especially if they're waking up from an arousal, and especially if that arousal has something to do with respiratory or some type of apnea or anything, it will often be a lot higher in amplitude. It's like catching your breath. So we're going to look in these next 4 epochs here. Look at our baseline using our reference line for our pressure channel. It seems to be pretty consistent up until about the 90-second mark, where you can see the difference between the bottom of each channel is kind of decreased between those 2 to 3 breaths there. So between 90 and about 105 in that area there. It's not very significant, but it could be something that led to a desaturation. So we're gonna double check. Looks pretty consistent around 95, 96. It does drop down to 93 from the 95 at about 65 seconds. But again, that's still only 2%. So it's not exactly a ASM desaturation qualifying for a hypopnea. So we kind of determined that their baseline is around 95, 94. Sometimes when they have a little strong breath, they may make it up to about 96. So you see in 56, it's about 95. It goes down to 94 a little bit. But then when we move on to about 57, it goes up slightly, but doesn't really go anywhere, at least further down. So it goes up to 96 and peaks there. And then it only goes down to about 94. So that 2% desaturation is pretty normal, not anything significant. People's amount of air can change at any moment in the night, especially people coming to the sleep lab that could possibly have some type of other respiratory problems. So you can see that slight change in the effort. So typically when it comes to your belts, it's usually going to be artifact, especially if you look in your flow channels and they're pretty consistent. So compared to the chest channel where it's kind of flat looking, and then looking at the flow channels, they aren't really in sync. So that's typically how you can tell that the effort belts are having artifact, is to look in your flow channels to see if they coincide with what it is. If it doesn't coincide, then it's likely just artifact. Now, if all of those channels were flat, then it'll be like a central. But since it isn't, we're gonna move on to the next 4 epochs. So we're looking at 60 through 63. So what we like to do is we're gonna look at our reference line. So in ISR, you can just double click over the channel and it will bring this up. Or you can right click and click annotate. So looking at the bottom of the baseline, not too many changes. You do have some slight changes around 40 to about 50, 55. So you can see the bottom of the channels are a lot different. Even the if you can actually look at the breasts right beforehand and see how they're different from the breast that is right before and the breast right after. So we have that decreased airflow. We'll look in our SaO2 to see if there's any 3% desaturation to go with it, or was that not enough to really cause the oxygen levels to go down. So it goes down to about 94 here, which is still at 2%. So our peak is at 96. So nothing really significant here, but it just goes to 94 and then goes right back up. So we see continuous movement in the airflow channels, no changes in oxygen. So we're gonna move on. Now looking at 64 through 67. So again, we're gonna look at your oxygen levels. It looks pretty consistent here. So you can see with the graphical line in our SaO2, pretty continuous. So not any changes that we can necessarily look for. So if you use that little reference line, you can see that it's pretty consistent. It peaks at the bottom at 94 and at the top at 96. So nothing very significant. Now, one thing I do want to point out that earlier our baseline was typically around 94, 95. At this time, our patient seems to kind of be hovering around 95, 96 in comparison. And that can just be a natural phenomenon with their breathing. It could be the patient has switched positions and maybe they're on their side versus on their back, to where they're getting more air coming through and not having that decreased airflow and associated hypopneas. Okay, so continuing on, we're going to look right back at our pressure channel using our reference line to look at the bottom and the top of each channel to see if there's any changes or really any significant changes when it comes to amplitude in the airflow. I'm going to close that. And then looking here at these bottom channels again, we got that artifact back in the abdominal. It's a little bit more difficult to read than before, but remember, typically as long as we have at least one working respiratory effort channel, like that chest belt, is pretty consistent. I would use that as a reference rather than the abdomen belt you see all this artifact in. So typically those have a kind of distinct waveform. So you can see in between where it's like 2 or 3 small little waves in the abdomen belt lines up with about 1 singular wave in the chest belt. So just comparing the two together, because obviously the patient's breathing normally, their chest and abdomen will likely be going in the same phase. So sometimes if it's out of phase, you may just have to invert your channel, or specifically when it comes to the polarity of the channel. In different programs, you can adjust the channel and their specific polarity of waveforms. So that's the same when it comes to airflow channels. Your EKG, if that's ever randomly upside down, that is when you would invert your polarity to make it easier to observe. Now we're going to move on to the next set of 4 epochs. We're going to have 67 here at the front, between 67 and epoch 70. So on 67, you see pretty consistent waveforms. There is a slight little hiccup or change that happens around about 25 seconds. So you can kind of see it, the slight change in all of the channels. So if you look in your pressure channel here, you see a pretty consistent flow until you get to 25, where it the amplitude at the bottom peak isn't the same as the amplitude of the bottom peak of the breath before and after. We do see that artifact in our bottom two channels, the little flat lines. But even though we have those flat lines, when you see our airflow channels are continuously flowing, you know that the effort belts are just experiencing artifact. Now, despite artifact, with the respiratory belts can often receive artifact, but when there's movement, when there's no movement at all, it's often works correctly. So you see 4 flat lines in two from your flow channel and then 2 from both your effort channels. It's not going to be a question if that's essential or not, because it is reacting to movement. If there is no movement, there's no reaction. So looking at the the oxygen levels seems to be floating around 95 to 96, and then dropping down to about 94 until about between 69 and 70, where we do have that desaturation that happens there from 85 seconds up until around about 100, 105, where that patient transitions to being awake. So specifically looking at that, we're going to see if there's any associated arousals that happen. And what you can see during that moment is when there is an arousal. So when events and arousals happen at the same time, you can see the arousal in the EEG, chin, even a little bit in your EKG channel. It's likely from movement. Patient probably switch positions. You can see a lot of movement going around in the effort channels. You know, when somebody is moving around, typically it's going to be some effort in their core, especially when they're in the bed. So oftentimes during movement, those can increase and be very high in amplitude. So we're just re-evening out my channels so they're observable. So you can see still in the abdomen channel, it goes all the way up almost into our pressure channel at the same time. So I'm going to highlight this to put in that there was an EEG arousal here. So since that was an arousal, it's not apnea. So we're going to continue on. So if that patient wasn't having any, I'm going to put 1 arousal there. Since it's between the 2 epochs in ISR, I will notate that there was an arousal in 69 and 70, but here you can see in epoch 70 is actually the patient is awake, so we're not going to score any arousals when the patient's awake. So the arousal happened in 69, epoch 69, wherein the patient was asleep. That arousal caused them to wake up in epoch 70, which is why technically there's not an arousal in 70, just in 69. But when it comes to highlighting areas in just the regular sleep world, you'd highlight that full area as the arousal. Because instead of doing epoch by epoch and saying if there's any events in there, all you'll be doing is basically making annotations like that blue box I have up there. Okay, so continuing on, we're going to have our epoch 70 and move to 71 through 74. So again, we're going to look at our pressure channel first, see if there's any possible hypopneas, any possible changes. So specifically, we're looking for any decreases in amplitude, which will show our decreased airflow. We can look at the top and the bottom of each channel. So in this pressure channel, it seems to be pretty consistent. There are some slight changes that are happening. So we see a couple changes that happen between 10 and about 20 to 25 seconds. So when looking at that, we will look back down to the oxygen levels here. You can can see it peaked, the bottom peak is at 93, goes up to 96, but then after that it kind of hovers around 95 to 96 for the continuation of these next 4 epochs. So that slight decrease in amplitude in the pressure channel isn't exactly a hypopnea. We do see, when we look back in 70, there was that decrease in amplitude of airflow. Just remember that patient was awake. So obviously we're not going to score any sleep disturbances such as apnea or hypopneas or anything because the patient's awake. So we'll move on to N1, where you see if there's any true differences that causes any change in oxygen after the fact. So we know 70, they're awake, so it's not going to cause any changes. Likely that change in that position and the way they were breathing for those few moments while they were awake caused that oxygen to drop that 3%. But it is not significant to the point where we could score anything because remember, they're awake. So I'm just going to make a note in here that there is a decreased airflow even though the patient is awake, so this is not going to be a hypopnea. So just notating that that still has a decreased airflow, but since the patient is awake, there will be no hypopnea. I'm going to add that in here as well. 3% of DSAP and PT for patient, and the patient is awake. 3% desaturation, patient awake during the airflow decreased, so it doesn't constitute a hypopnea. So we're going to skip over to epoch 75 through 78, our next set of 4. So overall, just taking a first glance at it, we can look first at our oxygen levels, and we can clearly see that there isn't really a significant drop in oxygen. So let's look at our pressure or our airflow channels and look specifically at our PTAF, so pressure transducer airflow. Baseline is pretty much consistent amplitude wise, and really you don't even really need the reference lines for that. You can kind of just look at it and you can see that the bottom and the top peaks of each breath is pretty consistent. Up until about 115, there's a slight change you can see in the effort channels, but you can also see the slight increase in pressure of the airflow channel. So moving on to 78, so we can see the difference between 78 and 79. So you have that increase in pressure. So let's see if it's a arousal that maybe caused that. So we have a burst of muscle frequency. So the patient likely moved a little bit. There's not really much going on in the snore channel, so I wouldn't say it's any type of coughing or anything like that. It's likely that the patient maybe just slightly changed positions or had a possible, body jerk that occurred. So after looking at that, we can go back to our respiratory. Now that we know that there was something that happened in there, even though it wasn't apnea related. So I'm just going back to verify that it's not just an arousal or anything, and verifying that it's just that movement. So remember, with the arousals, you're going to want a shift in frequency. Typically it's going to be a faster frequency, so your alpha or beta activity You're going to want to see that shift in frequency for a minimum of 3 seconds. So remember, minimum of 3 seconds. That burst of muscle activity that we had was about 2.5. So that necessarily didn't qualify as an arousal, but it did cause some changes. So we made a note of that. So I'm just going to save this. So in ISR, you can save your own custom montages. I'm saving this respiratory montage because it already has my channels adjusted to where they're pretty evenly spaced and not jumping into each other. So if you look between the respiratory and my custom respiratory, you can see a big difference. So when I go back, I don't have to adjust my gain at all. It already looks pretty normal. So I'm just going to add a note in here. PTMBT is just shortened for patient movement. I'm putting that in a note so I know that's not any changes in like a rear, so not any respiratory effort related arousals, but just the patient simply moving around. Let's look at this oxygen level here. So looking at our oxygen levels, we're still around 95. It does peak up to 96 and 97 around there. We have some DSATs from 96 to 94 there, and from 97 and it goes down to about 95. So you see, and it kind of settles in around 95, 96 there. So 1 to 2% desaturation obviously isn't much going on. So we're not going to be scoring any hypopneas or anything like that. We're going to continue on. So now we're going to be looking at 80 through 83. So first, you can take a look at the flow of our channels. Again, we still have that artifact in our abdomen belt. It's starting to kind of clear up here and there, but that's all right. So in our oxygen channel, our SAL2, seems to be pretty consistent. Again, around 96, 95. We have that reference line to see any major changes. Obviously, not much going on there. So we'll close out of that. And then take a look back at our airflow channels to see if there's any significant changes or anything that goes on. So using my reference line here, I'm going to look at my baseline. So you can see in that thermistor channel, there is a slight event that happens from 90 to 100 where I'm highlighting at here, where it looks, so there's that decreased airflow. So we're going to put in decreased airflow and see if it's possibly if it connotes a hypopnea. And it will if we look into that next set of 4. Well, I guess we don't even have to look to the next set of 4. Our next epoch after 83, it starts at 96. It does start to go down a little bit, so it goes down from 95 to 94. So we'll see if it goes on to looking to being at 93. So no, it only goes down. So you can see, looking back in the oxygen, our SAO2 channel with our reference line, you see changes around 55 seconds, about 1% drop, and then again around 84. So you can see that it drops to 3% right there. So from 96 all the way down to 93. Now, oftentimes you can see if we look at our stages at the bottom there, patient is in N2, N1, N2, and then they transition over to REM towards the end, where we have that first 3% desaturation. So it's actually pretty typical of REM to come through and show a desaturation and hypopneas. So that is not surprising at all. So I'm going to put in this 3% desat. And I'm going to go slightly back so we can look at that pressure channel to see where that decreased airflow may have come from. So looking in here, using our reference line, you can actually see, even without using the reference line, at the bottom of these flows between 15 and 30-ish. Those 1, 2, 3 breaths that happen just after that first round of decreased airflow. pop up, as well as in 84. So looking at that reference line, you can see how many are further away from our little baseline there. So the breath between 35 and 50, duration of 11 seconds. So that is going to be our decreased airflow. And I'm actually going to go ahead and put in that hypopnea because we already discovered that there was that 3% desaturation that happened just before it. So typically how it goes is there's going to be a hypopnea, a moment of decreased airflow, and then it will then be followed. There we go. It will then be followed by your 3% or more desaturation. So your hypopnea is that area of decreased airflow. Again, hypo, low, nia, air. So low air is going to cause that desaturation. So our baseline around gets up to 96, and then it's going to drop down 3%, which leads us to that bottom peak of 93%. So going into REM here, typically when you're moving into REM, you can actually expect to see more hypopneas, more desaturation, and a more kind of chaotic, uneven airflow. So after bottom peaks at 93, it goes back up to their, normal kind of their normal oxygen levels around 95. It kind of continues around 95, 96, 94 area for the rest of those 4 epochs. So we're going to look at these flows here again, in your pressure channel specifically, to see if there's any changes in the amount of air a patient is breathing. So a change in the amount of air, so any shallow breathing, more than 10 seconds, that either leads to an arousal or at 3% desaturation is what we will designate as a hypopnea. So we already checked that oxygen levels are pretty consistent in these 4, so between 85 and 88. So nothing in between there is going to necessarily be a hypopnea. It'd just be decreased airflow. And we'd continue on. So you see at the end of 88, there are some changes in the airflow there. I move forward to see it at between 88 and 89, if there were any changes that we are seeing while that patient's in REM. So I'm looking at 86, and I am noticing this what could look like artifact. We have an increase in amplitude among a couple of channels here. So you have it in your abdomen channel, as well as your pressure and your snore channel. So it's possible a patient could possibly have had a singular cough, or so forth. So typically with REM, you will likely have less arousals just because your body is so relaxed and it's gone through that paralyzing process. So you'll see less arousals. When you go into scoring arousals, the flows change up a little bit from REM to N1, N2, N3. So here I'm looking at this pressure channel. So when it comes to arousals and REM, which I was just talking about, it's typically going to debate on if there's any increased amplitude in the chin electrode. And that's the only stage where that's actually relevant. All the rest of the arousal criteria is just the 3 seconds and the shift in frequency. So again, we start to see some changes in the airflow. The frequency as well as the amplitude changes a lot. When it comes to REM, you get a lot of mixed frequency airflows. So sometimes they'll be breathing faster, sometimes they may be breathing a little slower. It kind of just jumps around. So we're gonna look at here. It's a moment of that decreased airflow, especially if you look at the bottom. If you look at the bottom of this channel here, the reference line at the bottom is very far from those couple of breaths. So we're wondering if that's a hypopnea. I haven't looked at the oxygen levels yet to 100% be able to tell, but we're gonna see. We'll close the pressure channel and let's look at the oxygen to see if there's any 3% desats. So it's kind of starting at 96, 95-ish, goes down about 1%, and goes back up to 96, but it only goes down to 94 here. So a 3% we would be looking for a 93. So no hypopnea. So you can see those breaths that happen directly after it are pretty large, which could be a reason that that patient didn't have any associated desaturation. Those breaths after the decreased airflow compensated for that. So it dropped a little bit, but after it did that, it actually went right back up. So it went from 96 to 94. But after those compensating breaths, it went up to 96. So moving on, we start to see a lot of changes that happen in 91 and 92. So like I was saying earlier, the airflow is pretty inconsistent when it comes to REM sleep. We do see that there is a 93% in there, but coming from that 93, we're actually peaking at 95. So since the airflow was about 95 beforehand, there is that little decrease in airflow, but it only goes down 2%. So we can clearly see where the breaths start to change. We can clearly see the desaturation, but what we don't see is that it's a 3%. So you have a 2% desaturation going from 95 to 93. So despite that decreased airflow, the breaths that occurred after that decreased airflow kind of made up for it, causing our oxygen levels to stay pretty consistent. Now, oftentimes in REM, you can also have these moments of central apnea, but you can also have times where it's just a brief pause. So, with apnea, you're going to want a minimum of 10 seconds. So that area I just highlighted, it is flat in each channel, so in your flow channels as well as the effort channels, but it is not reaching our 10 seconds, so it's not really significant. So we're going to check in 92 to see if there was an arousal or something that happened here, and it looks like, let's see, yes, so there was one arousal. So only reason that arousal was scored, so we can see in the chin channel you have an increase in chin amplitude, and that is how and when we can score our arousals in REM. If you remember correctly, your REM sleep, you will have those moments of a shift in frequencies. So it's called that paradoxical alpha. So I'm going to add in this decreased airflow notation, even though we don't know if it's a hypopnea yet. Let's look back down at that oxygen channel. So we went from 93 to 96, kind of floating around 96, 95-ish. So no 3% desaturation coming from that decreased airflow there. But that is what could That is what could have caused the increase in the breaths that come after it, as well as the snoring and the snore time. So increase in that amplitude. So criteria in duration, we made it, but criteria in the sense of desaturation, we did not. So with ISR, with your hypopnea, since there is that arousal that happened there, that's where we can score a hypopnea in here. So either that 3% desaturation to follow, or an arousal after that decreased airflow. So you can see with the decreased airflow, the also decreased effort that comes along with it. You can see right after that happens that it has the very large waveform at about 45. So I pull up this drop down menu and I go to respiratory, and for whatever reason I did not add that hypopnea there because of the decreased airflow, making it 10 seconds, and that arousal that happens immediately after it, that will be counted as a hypopnea through the ASM guidelines, which we are following the 3% desaturation rule. So the 3% desaturation or the arousal that follows the 10 seconds of decreased airflow. There's two differences. There is the ASM ruling. There's also the Medicare ruling. Depending on your lab, it depends on how you will be scoring. At the VA, what we do is a 4%, so we're using the Medicare criteria. So with the 4% desaturation, you don't necessarily need an arousal. So the desaturation of 4% is enough to score. But in terms of ASM, American Academy of Sleep Medicine, they want that 3% desaturation or the arousal. Okay, so in the last few epochs we have here, 93 being our last one that was staged, we can see that the oxygen levels don't really do much changing. So the airflow is pretty consistent, effort pretty consistent, and our oxygen levels are ranging around 95, 96, 97. Does go up to a 97, but does not come down to a 3% desaturation. So that is it for this one. Next lecture we'll go over 94 to 200.